But hello, everybody. Welcome to our post-election briefing. I'm Gwen Mandel, Director of National Outreach at Independent Voting. I hope everyone is hanging in there in these very challenging times. It's a little rough. First of all, welcome to those of you who are with us for the first time. And thank you actually to everyone who sent all the really great questions in. We actually received well over 100. Actually, I think we're up to like 125, 130 now. We'll be tackling many of them in tonight's discussion. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A chat, which is separate from the regular chat that you're in right now. We'll be taking a few questions from the Q&A chat a little later. So you can put some questions in there as they come to you. Right now, there has been a lot of talk about democracy, whether it's functioning or not, and unifying the country, whether we should or we shouldn't, whether we can or we can't. It's actually really good to be with you today to just take pause, really take a deep breath and look at where we are, talk about how we can make the voice of independence even more powerful. So for those of you who are new to independent voting and our movement, we thought that it would be helpful to take a look together at a brief statement of who we are and what we believe. So here it is. Independent voting was founded in 1994 to be a voice for America's independent voters. This community of nonpartisan Americans is now over 40% of the public, but it faces many barriers and biases in the electoral process. Political parties call the shots, and the pundits refuse to learn who we are. But more and more Americans from all walks of life want a free and fair election system where the people, not the parties, come first. So very simple, very straightforward. That's what we stand for. Before we delve into our program, let me introduce my co-host, Steve Huff, Director of Florida Fair and Open Primaries. I'm sure Steve will tell you more about Amendment 3, the nonpartisan primaries measure that was on the ballot in Florida. I wanted to take an opportunity to congratulate Steve publicly on the really amazing job he's did in coordinating a grassroots effort to mobilize thousands of Floridians. Steve is probably too modest to admit this. Actually, I know he is. But I feel certain that without Steve's day-to-day work, Amendment 3, which won the support of a majority of voters in Florida, would never have materialized. So congratulations, Steve, and welcome. It's really great to see you. Take it away.
Thank you, Gwen. Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Huff, the Director of Florida Fair and Open Primaries and co-founder of Florida Open Primaries. I'm pleased and honored to co-host tonight's event. As many of you are aware, the state of Florida just voted on a proposed constitutional amendment to adopt a top 2 open primary system. In Florida, 60% approval is required to pass a constitutional amendment, and we came up a bit short at 57%. So for the time being, we're still a closed primary state. But we believe the message was clear. A majority of Florida voters want open primaries. We're now reflecting on what future steps can be taken to capitalize on this pent-up demand, and we hope to attract even more supporters and coalition partners in the coming months. Those of us who are independents know the drill. The major political parties prevent us from participating in their nominating process or force us into partisan silos. Then, once the nominees are selected, they quickly acknowledge the importance of our votes. With that in mind, this evening's call will take a wider view of the role independents played in the national election, and I'm anxious to hear some takeaways from an independent perspective. Jackie Salit has been in the forefront of independent politics for decades, and her book, Independence Rising, inspired me to become more active as an independent voter, and it's the only book I've ever read more than once. So if you're new to the independent movement, I highly recommend you give it a read. So without further ado, let's hear from Independent Voting President Jackie Salit.
Steve, hi, thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for that terrific introduction. Wow, I'm really glad that you read my book more than once. I consider that like a pretty high compliment. That's like the best review I've gotten since the book was published. I mean, seriously. So,
Well, might have to read it a third time since it's not on Kindle.
That's right.
Kindle, it's easy to take notes.
That's great. And let me just add my own personal congratulations to you for the incredible job in Florida. I know we're going to get those 3 more points in the next go around, and just such a magnificent job and such an incredible teachable moment, I think, for the country and for so many different political players. So I really appreciate all of what you and your team did, and special thank you to the voters that really stepped up and said, hey, this is a direction that we need to go. And so great for them.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. And I'm so glad we have this time to spend together. I have a lot of ground that I want to try to cover as quickly as possible. And I brought my trusty election results notebook with me, which I'm going to consult during the course of the discussion to try to give you a picture of some things that I think would be important for us to look at together, not just tonight, but in the weeks and the months to come. Just a brief snapshot of where things stand at the moment. Much of this, I'm sure you already know, but we are sitting in a situation now nationally where the Biden-Harris ticket has 306 Electoral College votes in its column. The Electoral College hasn't met yet. That will happen in December. And a very rocky process of transition is underway in Washington. Of course, there's been tons of headlines and reporting and stories and about the fact that President Trump has not formally conceded, and consequently certain tripwires haven't been fired yet. And various things need to happen, and they're important for sure. I personally am confident that the transition, rocky as it is and will get across the finish line. There were some announcements today that President Trump tweeted that Biden won. Then he said a bunch of things about it being fraudulent, et cetera, and so forth. But in the weird world of what American politics is today, that's considered at least the beginning of a formal concession process that leads to a transition. So as I say, a lot more to go there, but that transition, I think, will occur. The transition that I'm more interested in and that I wanted to talk to you about is the transition that the American people need to go through. The thing that's happening in Washington is the governmental transition, and it's important, and it's important that it be peaceful and that it be complete. The government is not the only entity that's going through a transition. Actually, the country is going through a transition, and frankly, I think it's a very difficult one. I frankly think it's a lot harder than the transition that's going on in Washington. If you read the headlines in the paper, if you watch the news, if you follow social networks and social media, et cetera, the headlines are kind of pretty much in the same vein. America divided, the country is divided, we're a divided country, the government is divided, it's all about division, et cetera. And on the one hand, if you look at the state of the governmental apparatus at the national level, this is a true statement. The Democratic Party is in the process of taking the White House and picked up 1 additional Senate seat so far. Of course, the disposition on the Senate is not resolved yet. It's going to be 2 runoff elections in January, which is going to determine who controls, from a partisan point of view, the Senate. The Republicans picked up 11 seats in the House. The Republicans picked up control of 2 state legislatures and 1 gubernatorial race. So this was a robust election, I would say, on both sides. There was not a massive mandate on either side. So on the one hand, you could say, well, okay, you look at the picture and the country is divided, the country's divided, the country's divided. But I think that a question that we have to ask ourselves and ask our fellow citizens and countrymen and women is whether we are divided or whether we are being divided. And I want to ask us all to reflect on the latter proposition, that we are being divided, because I think this is an issue that we in our transition, which is not going to take weeks, it's going to take longer than that. This is an issue, I think, a question that we have to take up for ourselves. You know, on the day, I guess it was a Saturday after Election Day, the votes were still being counted. A winner had not been declared yet. It was in the morning on Saturday, and I was watching CNN for coverage. And I had been flipping around to different channels and, you know, trying to look at different sources, which, by the way, is something they say that independents do. I do. I had been watching different places, and then I landed on CNN for a while. I had actually spent a fair amount of time on CNN because I really couldn't believe how great John King was with the tallies and the maps and the counties and all of that. It just was like, wow, what an incredible job he did. We should make him election commissioner or something, whatever, some kind of job like that. But anyway, there was a panel, and it was kind of sort of the A team panel. It was David Axelrod, who had been Obama's campaign manager, and Van Jones, who's a very, very astute and kind of forward-thinking analyst. Gloria Borger and Anderson Cooper was hosting it, and Rick Santorum was on the panel. And he's a former US Senator from Pennsylvania. And of course, the Pennsylvania count was going on and was, you know, just about to be called for the Democrats, and a conservative. And so the panel was kind of getting into a whole thing about the unity. You know, we have to unify the country. The country's been divided. We have to bring people together. Unity, unity, unity. Let's get unified. That's the American way, and all this kind of stuff. And Santorum was being a little bit circumspect about this. And so at one point he said, I really agree with you. It's important for the country to be unified, and that's a very important principle. But he said, we just spent 18 months and $16 billion with each side claiming that the other side was an existential threat to our nation, to the United States of America, to our democracy, to the American way. So Santorum was saying, well, how do you unify a country that has just been through that? And I have to say, I thought that was, a pretty important insight. Thank you, Rick Santorum, for bringing that up on national television. This is something that independents and that the culture of the independent movement has just been hugely concerned about, interested in working on, trying to address really for years and years. But at the moment, I think we're probably at the most extreme version of the negative impact of the ways in which people are turned against each other, the ways in which demonization rules the political game. And I would propose to all of us and to the American people that ultimately the way that we are going to be able to create a path to unity is that we're going to have to find ways to understand and to respond to the ways in which we are deliberately divided from one another. How do we do that? How do we create that pathway? Well, that really is at the core of what it means to build an independent movement in this country. And frankly, there may not have been a mandate for the Democratic Party, and there may not have been a mandate for the Republican Party. But in my view, the results of the election in so many different ways and from so many different angles show us that there is a mandate for addressing and responding to and reorganizing this fundamental dynamic of how politics is done in this country. That's the transition that I'm most interested in. It's much, much more difficult than what they're handling in Washington right now. And I want us to talk a little bit about how to get there, how to pursue that. But before I do that, before I tell you some things about the independent vote and different dynamics in the race, and I want to talk a little bit about where's the Democratic Party, where's the Republican Party, where's the independent movement and all of that. I want to pause just for one moment because I do want to say a word about the election of Kamala Harris to the vice presidency and the historic nature of that, of having a woman elected to that position, a woman of color, a Black woman from Indian and Jamaican descent. I'm very proud of that. And I know that many, many Americans are proud of that and feel that that is an important thing. I certainly do. And I also want to say, relative to that important step for our country, that there are many people on whose shoulders she stood, and many, many people who were the trailblazers that came before that laid the groundwork for that. And many of them are known and some of them are not so known. And there's one in particular that I want to pay a special tribute to tonight. Many of you know her. She's someone who's very important to me personally and to our movement. Mike, can we take a look at this picture I want to show you? This is Dr. Lenora Fulani. For those of you who don't know her or know of her, she, in 1988, was the first woman and first African-American to access the presidential ballot in all 50 states. I was on the road with Dr. Fulani in 1988. I think we were somewhere down south. I don't even remember exactly where. And a reporter was interviewing her and they said, oh, Dr. Fulani, you know, you're running for president. Which is harder, being Black or being a woman? And Lenora didn't miss a beat. She said, well, actually, neither of those. The hardest thing is being an independent. And that was such a meaningful statement and such incredible groundwork that was laid by Dr. Fulani and all of the people who've worked on her behalf for many years, gave birth to the Reform Party, the Pro movement, and raised many, many questions that are now very much on the table. So thank you so much, Lenora, for all that you've done for our movement. And we honor you. We honor you in this moment. So moving on here, let me tell you some things about what happened with the independent vote and see if I can run through them for you. Okay, so independents were 26% of the total electorate in this election. They were 31% of the electorate in 2016. The real numbers, the actual numbers are very, very close to one another. 42.5 million independents is estimated voted in 2016, 41.5 million independents in 2020. That's what the exit polling is showing. I don't completely buy the differential, frankly, because as we all know, a lot of people don't really tell the truth to pollsters, but be that as it may, I also think, frankly, a lot of independents registered into the Democratic Party in the course of the last year in order to be able to vote in the primary, because there are so many states that don't allow independents to vote. That's how come Steve and his folks had to run that big campaign in Florida. That's something that we need to deal with, and we really, really need to deal with it now in a very, very hard and galvanized way in the states that don't allow that. So I think that that's part of what accounts for that. All right, so independents were 26% of the electorate. What did independents do? They broke 54 to 41 for the Biden-Harris ticket over President Trump. About 5% voted for independent candidates. Let me say here that just historically speaking, this is a very big swing. This is a 13-point differential in this case for the Biden-Harris ticket. Trump won independents by 4 points in 2016. Obama won them by 8 points in 2008. And so part of what you see when you look at that pattern is you see independents are not aligned in ideological terms. We operate on the basis of yes, a set of values, and I want to talk some about what they are, but they operate on the basis of being a force to try to make certain kinds of changes in the way that we do politics. I would say, if I had to, sometimes like the pollsters and the sociologists and whatever like to come up with all these categories to describe people, the suburban soccer mom and the entrepreneurial African-American man and the and on and on and on. I don't really like those categories generally, but if I had to say, well, who is the independent voter? Now that we're seeing certain kinds of patterns over the last 15 years, I would say independents are troublemakers and they are peacemakers. And when they believe that it is time to make a move to try to shake up the system, shake loose the political priorities and challenge the political establishment, they make that happen. And when they see a kind of instability that's going on that is dangerous, of the kind that we're dealing with now in the context of a COVID pandemic, of a very, very serious economic crisis, they will step up and say, let's make a move that calms things down a little bit. But independents are not done. Independents are just at the beginning of the process of shaping and reshaping the political landscape in this country. Independents were the margin in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Georgia. And they're very close to being the margin in the popular vote. So these are very, very vital statistics that tell a story not just about the outcome of one particular election. It's a story about changing trends in American political life and a new force that's banging on the door of partisan politics and saying, oh my God, we have got to find a way to do things differently. There's one quote that I want to show you. This is like really such a cool quote. This appeared in the Fulcrum, which is a wonderful news service that specializes in covering the democracy movement and covering political reform, gave a great deal of coverage to Florida. Take a look at this quote. This is such a great summary of how this goes, because as soon as the statistics are there, the pundits and the political operatives essentially let all of that fade away as they start chewing on the election results to spin their story. So here we have the Fulcrum kind of telling it like it is, despite the fact that they're treated like the ugly stepchildren of democracy. Anyone looking forward to a Joe Biden presidency can thank unaffiliated voters. So I love that quote. Thank you, Mike. I love that quote. I love the idea of being the ugly stepchildren of democracy. It made me think actually of Cinderella, because she was kind of like an ugly stepchild, but then she ended up on top at the end. I'm not talking about marrying a prince here. Meghan Markle already did that. But I'm talking about prevailing to bring about a culture of openness and decency and caring. And yes, the ugly stepchildren, we will make it happen. I want to tell you a couple of things in just a couple of short minutes about things I'm learning from looking at how the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are analyzing the results. Okay, I watched a bunch of things. I saw some Democratic Party operatives at some webinar or something I went to, some prestigious institute for something or other. Anyway, they have these like really high level operatives and they're talking about, the Democratic Party win. And they're like, we have Georgia and Arizona. And now soon we're going to have North Carolina and Florida, but we have Georgia and Arizona. I'm like, oh my God, I cannot believe this. First of all, if you want to talk about Arizona does not belong to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party won Arizona because of an incredibly vibrant coalition of independent voters and Latino voters. And by the way, 41% of Latinos in Arizona are independents. That's what happened in Arizona. The Democratic Party doesn't own Arizona any more than it owns Georgia, which, by the way, if you want to talk about what happened in Georgia, it was a vibrant coalition of independent voters and African-American voters that put the Biden-Harris ticket over the top. So It's that kind of attitude, what belongs to whom, that I think just drives the American people crazy. And this is really one of the main reasons that so many Americans, independents, but many Democrats and Republicans just don't have trust and confidence in the government and in the way the parties operate. The Democratic Party has some things that they're going to have to deal with now. They've got a fight going on between the political center and the left. They're going to have to figure out how to work that out. There's a whole thing going on about how come they lost those 11 seats, and was it because they were too radical or because they were too moderate? Whatever. I'm going to let them deal with that. I actually don't think that's their critical question. I think their critical question is, what are they going to do about the democracy issue? They linked their campaign to the call for greater democracy, to the call to expand the franchise and to have everyone have the right to vote. Well, how far are they willing to go on that question? That's the issue that we have to put on the table now. And you may have seen this reported in the news, 170 political organizations, good government organizations, reform organizations put out a statement to President-elect Biden saying, oh, now you have to move ahead with the democracy agenda, and we have to bring HR 1 back, and which was the big omnibus bill that Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats introduced in the House. And it has a lot of good stuff in it. I won't argue with that. But does not have one word in it, not one word in it about independent voters, not one word about the distortions and the deprivations that are built into our system now that require that people join a political party in order to have a full and a fully enfranchised voice in the political process. So that is something that we have to take up both with the Democratic Party and, frankly, with the good government movement and the reform movement, who tend to look away from us ugly stepchildren when it suits their convenience to do that. There's another subplot that the Democrats have to deal with too, which is the question of Democratic Party's longstanding relationship to the African-American community. And here I want to point to a greatly underreported story, which is the passage of Proposition D in St. Louis. This enacted a top 2 nonpartisan open primary system in the city of St. Louis. It's right next to Ferguson, and a lot of the vote was propelled by the events in Ferguson with the murder of Michael Brown. And 68% of the voters in St. Louis voted this up, while the official party apparatus in the state opposed it. And this campaign was led by a very diverse grouping of people, but including some very, very important African-American leaders in the city and in the area and in the country. Mike, would you put up my next slide for me, if you would? Please take a look at this. This is a wonderful piece that ran in the Fulcrum, authored by Reverend Darrell Gray, who is one of the local leaders of this effort, and by Dr. Jesse Fields, national independent leader, a physician on the front lines of the fight around COVID, also a member of the Independent Voting Board, just a wonderful, wonderful person. And they raise this issue of the importance of the intersection between the democracy reform agenda, the nonpartisan democracy reform agenda, and the longstanding fight for civil rights and voting rights in the Black community. And so this is going to become more and more of an issue that is being talked about, that's being fought over. There were all kinds of plays and counterplays around this, below the surface and not so below the surface, during the course of this campaign, both in St. Louis and in Florida and in elsewhere. But this is an issue that the independent movement has to bring forth and push to the forefront. Thanks for this slide, Mike. Finally, let me just say a word about the Republican Party and what the Republican Party has to confront. They may end up controlling the Senate. They may not. That will be determined. They got a lot of votes. They got over 70 million votes for the top of the ticket, and that's a lot of votes. And I was watching a discussion among some Republican operatives and leaders talking about the future of the Republican Party and what the Republican Party has to deal with. Now, And one of the speakers brought up an issue or framed a conversation in a way that I thought was interesting and important. And I just want to share it with you kind of as we're coming to the end of our discussion here, or my briefing here. One of these people said, well, you know, we have to take a look at these votes. We have to take a look at this community of voters. We have to ask ourselves, was that vote a signal, use the word signal, was that vote a signal for like a set of issues, a set of policy issues? Policy on protectionism, on trade, on immigration, on taxes. Is that what that vote was? Or was that vote, he used the term noise, but he wasn't saying it like in a pejorative way, in a bad way. He was saying noise like as in a cry. Was that vote a cry that was a sign, a cry of distress by people who are fearful of being left behind by globalization, left behind by the predominance of elitist politics in Washington? And is that what that is about? So he was saying that this was something that the Republican Party needed to have a look at. I was very, I thought this was also a good comment to make and a good set of questions to raise for the Republican Party, surely, for all political players, and certainly for the independent movement, because I feel that we are very much a movement that is looking for the politics of something else. I just think there's so many people in this country who are looking for something else. And we are the movement of something else. And I think that it's so important to distinguish that from the demonization that has been so prevalent. You can't argue against hate. You can't take a stand against hate and then be a hater yourself. You can't do that. And so, yes, there are profound disagreements and differences within the American public. Those things are real. Some of them are harsh. Some of them are hard to deal with. But I think that we have to really find a way to insist that the country moves beyond demonization and hate and creates a politics, a movement for something else. Independents are the leaders of that movement. And now our job is to figure out how to capitalize on that, how to build off of that. And so many of the questions that people sent in, and I loved your questions. Thank you so much. It really was so informative for me and helped me think about things and was very, very provocative. But I got questions from all over the country, from Jim Martinez and Jim Lundberg and Jan Wooten and Kim Wright and Kirk Anderson and David Cherry and Jesse Fields and Omar Ali and I have been talking about these issues. How do we build off of these circumstances, the disarray of the parties and this incredible swing strength of the independent voter? One of the ways that we were able to do that during this campaign, and I just want to take one more minute here to give a shout out to 100 people. I'm not going to say all their names, but Mike, if you would put this slide up here, we had over 100 people who acted as spokespersons during the course of this campaign from many, many different parts of the country. And they did all kinds of different things. They were interviewed by print reporters. They were pre-interviewed by producers. Some of them made it all the way onto TV shows on MSNBC and CNN, and this week with George Stephanopoulos and Voice of America, and on and on and on. And some of them just went through the process of being interviewed, and some of them got their names into print, but all of them made just such an incredible statement about the values and the vitality and the vision of this movement. So I just want to put your names up on the screen so everybody could see it. I know it's too many to read all at this time, but I wanted to give you a personal thank you for that. And also say to everyone who's on the call tonight, if you would like to be trained as a spokesperson, we would love to train you. We have a great training program. You can sign up for it at the end of this call, and we will get you in the queue, and we will try to get you on TV and all the other places that you can go. So I'm going to wrap it up here. Here's what we need to do. We need to challenge the independent and reform movement to be willing to stand up for and support the inclusion and the rights of independent voters. We need to challenge the Democratic Party on its claim that it owns democracy reform, that it owns fairness. We've got to challenge that, challenge that, challenge that. And we've got to challenge the Republican Party and Republican Party voters on their claim that they own anti-establishment politics in this country, because they don't. The politics of this country belongs to the American people. And I think that's the message that independents have been trying to deliver in many different ways. We did the things that we did in this election. They are being noted, even if in some places they're already being swept under the rug. But we're going to keep lifting that rug and make sure that those voices are heard and that we can use the power that we are acquiring to the max to make our country and our democracy better, more wholesome, more inclusive, more effective for everyone. So with that, let me turn it back over to Gwen and take a few questions. But thank you all so much for joining us tonight.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jackie. That was wonderful. Appreciate that. So we have lots of questions in the chat, but we're going to take a few.
Okay.
Hopefully you've answered a lot of people's questions already. So there is a question from Michael Perez in California, and he is asking, what incentive structures exist that currently encourage pundits and the media to maintain the narrative of division and the tendency to ignore independence? I know.
I love that question. What kinds of incentives exist? A paycheck is one. Let me just say, wow, I don't even really know what to say about this. I thought the role of the media in this last election cycle was really pretty bad on all sides. And it really exploded after Election Day, where you just saw all of these media outlets substituting themselves, either for the voters or for the officials whose job it is to count the vote and to deliver the verdict on the outcome. The incentives are, look, it's a complicated thing. You're in the media, you want to have sources. You want to have sources, you want to have them in the party. You want to have them from people in power. People in power benefit from reinforcing those kinds of divisions. It's kind of like that. And that's one of the reasons, frankly, I think that it's just so important that we've really been developing our spokesperson group, and because they just fly in the face of that. And they have very, very different kinds of views on all kinds of things, but wow, are they able to convey that there is a sense in this country that truth has been hijacked across the board, that an ability to listen has been hijacked and taken away. And so we're going to have to rebuild that, I think, piece by piece, but a great question and a huge concern. Thank you. Thank you for that question.
Yes, thank you. Randy Miller asks, what acts of civil disobedience can we perform in protest of closed primaries? Can you say a little bit?
Oh, I love that. You know, we've done some things in the past on election days, both national and state election days, where independents stood outside of polling places with signs. This was pre-COVID, of course, that said, "I can't vote today, ask me why." There's like a famous iconic photograph of Jen Bullock, the leader of independent Pennsylvanians, standing in front of a polling site in Philadelphia with this sign. So we've done some things like that. Civil disobedience, well, I don't know. We're going to have to think about that. I appreciate you raising that question. Obviously, to some extent, I think that's going to turn on being able to participate in-person voting, at least in terms of what the history of civil disobedience has been. But look, when you're talking about, over 50% of new voters are registering or identifying as independents, when you're talking about close to 55% of young Americans who are coming of age to vote, and they're being told that if you're an independent and you live in such and such state, you're not going to be allowed to vote. This is a community and a constituency of young people who have come into a new form of activism. And I think as they begin to see that and have their experience, there's going to be some very strong civil demonstrations that go right at this question. And it's really all about the control of the parties. The parties should be able to compete in the political marketplace. They should not run the political marketplace.
Great, thanks. I'm going to try to take 2 more questions. I think that's what we have time for. I actually wanted to go to a question that came in earlier from Jim Lumberg, which I think is a really good question. He said, Joe Biden's closer than expected victory, coupled with the loss of Democrat seats in the US House, could mean that many people were voting against Donald Trump as opposed to embracing a blue wave agenda. If you agree, is this an opportunity for us to exploit voter unease with both major parties to advance the independent movement?
Yes, yes, and yes. I love this question, Jim. I have to tell you, part of, I read your question early on, and I spoke, some of the issues that I tried to speak to here were a way of addressing that. Look, I think the next year for us is going to be a lot of work, of tactical work to figure out exactly how to do it. Some of it is going to be locally based, some of it is going to be state-based, some of it is going to be nationally based. We've already started having discussions in different places about what would a run up to an all independents presidential primary in 2024 need to look like. But I think you're absolutely right. In some ways,